Good evening, folks. Welcome. Oh, just check my volumes. Let's just give that a little bit more volume. One, two, one, two. Check. Hello. Good evening, folks. Welcome to the stream. Sorry, it's been such a while. It's been a busy season for me, just as it always is at this time of year. So, between working weekends, and just being generally knackered, it's not really been um, it's not been great for doing streams, so unfortunately that's just been the case, and it will be the case for after Christmas, I imagine, for a good chunk of it until the summer. But that's how it is, real life kind of takes over. So yes, we're at that time of year again, and it's like got a little bit of time off, and I'll be popping back home to Melton Mowbray on the 27th to see my brother. So I've got that to look forward to, but I've got a nice quiet day on my own tomorrow with a big dinosaur-sized steak. So I'm kind of looking forward to that, to say the least. Let me just make a slight alteration. I've had to reset everything up. There we go. I've had to reset everything up because I've been doing some work on my computer. I've installed a NAS system, which is just a storage system, so it's all backups and all that kind of stuff. Still got to dump a bunch of stuff onto that. Reinstalled the OS and did a whole bunch of stuff, so everything's gone kind of awry, and I've had to completely rebuild OBS, and it's been like, god damn it, it's always the same. Um, Redo the OS and then everything's got to be reinstalled, and you're always going to forget something. And for whatever reason, this time around, Streamlabs didn't remember my setup. So there you go. It's how it is, isn't it? But I hope everybody's well. I hope everybody's been not working too hard, and now you're going to enjoy at least a few days off. I was working up until yesterday, so I feel like it was very, very quiet at work yesterday, it has to be said. I think I was probably about one of the very, very few people in the building. It was really, really quiet, to say the least. Which is, it's always a bit odd. Over summer, it's quiet for us because everybody's gone home. It's the holidays and all that kind of stuff. But it gets to Christmas, and it's like goes from absolute pandemonium to zero in like a couple of days. It's just crazy. Kerry's had a recent updates for OBS. Haven't checked what is different yet. Oh, I didn't know there was an update to it. I've had to completely reinstall, so it's like, so it's a bit of an adventure. It's always a bit hold your breath and hope that the chat still works on screen and things like that. And it's really the only reason I kind of use Streamlabs OBS rather than OBS Studio, is because the chat just works better on Streamlabs for me. At least I've always had fiddly kind of things sort of go on, so it's nice to have you guys on the screen. Have you not seen it yet? I had this done a year ago, Minty. Though I did shave it for tonight. I did properly shave it tonight. Nice razor cut just to make everything a little bit smoother. But yeah, I did pick up something over the last few weeks, the last couple of months, which is this. So if my brother's watching, you remember these? This is the Spectrum. It's a kind of like a retro release, re-release of the computers in question, be it the Nintendos and all whatever. So this thing is fully functional. I mean, all the keys work and all that kind of stuff. It looks like the original. It's the same size as the original, more or less the same weight as the original. Everything. It's just crazy how accurate this thing. It's great. It's great. So I'm loving this thing. I'm having a bit of a play with it. I've even got a couple of books because I want to teach myself a bit like machine code and stuff like that, which might be kind of fun to learn. The Spectrum, yes, looks exactly like the original. Yes, it's really, really good. If you're into like kind of the old ZX Spectrum, it's a great way to learn how to code and all that kind of stuff. It's a great introduction to that kind of stuff. You learn with BASIC and all that kind of stuff, and go into like assembly and machine code. I learned how to program on one of those things, and then I learned about another 4 languages, most of which I can't remember these days. It's been such a long time, but what a lovely little piece of kit. It really, really is. And the nice thing is it'll work with these as well. You can't Bluetooth it, I don't think, anyway. But you can connect up a game controller to it, which makes it so much more convenient. That was always one of the tricky things with the original Spectrum was sometimes the key layouts were very, very awkward. So using that, it's, well, you just imagine it's kind of like having a better version of having like a Kempston joystick or something. So that's kind of cool. Prefer the 6502 to the Z80. It's fair enough. It's whatever. I mean, that was the first computer that I had, was the 48K, shared with my brother. Load everything up on tape. That thing, when you put your own games on it, I don't know if there's a shortcut like quick load sort of thing, but the way it kind of picks up those games is it just literally loads the game like it's a tape. You get that whole kind of weight and everything. It's very nostalgic. And funny enough, the games don't seem to take as long as they seem to remember they used to, because it always felt like about 10 minutes load up time, but it's usually about 3 to 5 minutes max. So it's kind of cool. You have no clue regarding Spectrums. I mean, I was the right age back in the day for that thing. Absolutely the kind of target audience for stuff like that. It's really cool. I mean, the tricky thing with it, and I won't go on about this for too long, I don't know if you can see, it's a little hard to show. The red and green functions, you have to sort of like, because it works off keywords, you don't type everything in, you sort of like, if you want load and stuff, it's like kind of shift and J, as for instance. That was always a tricky thing when it came to programming with that thing, but yeah, it is what it is. Hello, Simon, I hope you're well. Bet you'll be playing Samantha Fox strip poker in no time on the Spectrum. It's probably on World of Spectrum. That's the thing, World of Spectrum has a lot of games on it. I wish they had like a packs that you could download instead of downloading them individually, but it's just lists and lists of, it lists just about every game that existed, and a lot of them are available. Some of them aren't, because some of the copyright holders still go, no, you can't do that. And you go, what, for like a 1987 8-bit program, you can't give up the copyright for that. You know, it's just a bit ridiculous, really. But yeah, so tonight I figured we'd do this kind of as a little bit of a for want of a better word, a lecture, really. Take a little bit of a trip down memory lane and talk about the history of the Nasties. I thought that'd be kind of a cool thing to do. So this is going to be a little bit it's going to have some brevity, shall we say. One of the things about the whole history kind of element of the video Nasties is that it's complicated, and it goes off in several different directions. You've got like the kind of the public facing end of it, you've got the parliamentary kind of end of it, and so many players involved with this whole thing that you can really go down several rabbit holes, and you'd have to have about 3 or 4 starting points. So what I've done is I've got bullet points, and there'll be as minimal jumping backwards and forwards as possible. I figured that would be probably the best way to sort of approach this. And we're going to really sort of start from I think the best place to start is probably, we're talking about early mid-70s. Right. Sip of beer before we get started. Let's see if we can get through this before I start slurring my words. All right. The time is about mid-70s. The scope of what you could watch on watch movies, how you could watch movies, tended to be, it would come on TV, usually in a heavily edited form, or it's kind of such a low-rated sort of film that I didn't feel the need to have too much cuts. Or you could go to the cinema. If you went to the cinema, all that stuff went through the BBFC, right? To watch a film that, again, would rely on you either sort of petitioning the cinema to bring it back, which of course, there's commercial concerns there, so that's a pretty difficult thing to get done, but you could get it done if you were tenacious enough. So short of watching it at the cinema, it's waiting for it to come out on TV, and that's how I kind of ended up first seeing Alien, as for instance, was a TV broadcast that was broadcast from, I think it was Anglia TV. We were in the central region, it was Anglia TV or something like that. So we only really were on the edge of that reception, and we got this black and white grainy video copy of Alien, which actually made it more terrifying. Sounding a little bit quiet. Okay. Let's try just giving that a little bit more. 2 seconds. Like I say, all my settings are a little bit out. Bluetooth devices. Tell you what, I'll just turn it up on the mixer. 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2. Let me just share this. Yeah, it's that one. 1 2. I'll bring the mic a little bit closer. I try not to block my view to the screens because there's a lot going on tonight. Anyway, yeah. So you had the choice of basically watching it at the cinema, maybe when it came round again, or petitioning the cinema to maybe bring it back, all that kind of stuff. That was the only option. So rewatching films is a very, very difficult process. Enter the VHS, the video cassette. Initially, it was very expensive. So there was this big problem of availability to just regular folks. So they were around about between £1,000 to £1,400 for a recorder. Bear in mind, obviously, that I think that is the times money, as opposed to kind of like, taking inflation into context. So it's a lot of money. Most people could not afford them. By the time we got to about the late 70s, early 80s, video recorders started to get rented out. So you would spend good money to, rent out a video plus the cassette. That was often a package. You would get the two. You would get the video recorder plus the film. With a hefty deposit and all of that kind of stuff. So there was just a lot going on when it came to it's still very expensive to do it that way. But of course, with the format wars and all this kind of stuff, you had VHS, Betamax, Video 2000, and a whole bunch of other different versions of these things were around. And the cost started coming down quite significantly. So by the time we got to the early 80s, it was still, they were still pretty expensive, out of the reach of most of the working class people, but they were still kind of possible. You could go out, rent it. It wasn't quite so much, all that sort of stuff. But they were becoming more popular. Video rentals, film rentals were becoming really, really, really popular. In fact, Britain was one of the countries that actually kind of started to lead the world in adopting the technology. So all of a sudden, and I do remember this personally, you had these shops popping up, and like little mum and pop type shops, for want of a better word. And you would go in there and you would just see these walls of videos around. And you could just, it was just something, it's like going into like a treasure trove. Just these amazing sort of artworks and all this kind of stuff. You could just choose what you wanted, when you wanted it, more or less. As long as they had it in stock, you could take it off the wall and take it home and watch that film. It was incredibly liberating. There was this amazing access that you suddenly had that you never had before. And I can't really sort of over-express how amazing an experience that was when it first came. Most people these days don't know any different. And it was quite seismic. Suddenly there's all these films that you never had the chance to watch, or would never have the chance to watch if it wasn't for these places suddenly available. And that came with a whole bunch of things that baggage, shall we say, that came with it. So we should go back a little bit at this point. Should we talk about the BBFC at this point? Yeah, probably. Okay. Video cassettes weren't basically didn't have to go through the same kind of circumstances as movies did. Movies had to go through the BBFC. So who are the BBFC? Well, the BBFC is the formerly British Board of Film Censorship, set up in 1913. They were there as a voluntary body, an industry set-up body, that films would have to go through to actually sort of get into cinemas and stuff. Because prior to that, there was a whole bunch of issues. And what most people don't realise is the only reason that the BBFC could actually exist is because cinemas had to be licensed, and they were licensed as a matter of health and safety. And it was when basically some council basically sued this cinema for opening up on a Sunday for moral reasons, that the courts decided that morality and those kind of concerns were also a part of health and safety. So when this Cinematographic Act was passed, which covered all that kind of stuff and allowed local authorities to dole out licenses to cinemas and stuff like that, they started to use that as a result of this case to be able to go, we don't like the kind of stuff that you're putting on, so we're taking away your license. So what was originally a basic health and safety, fire safety and all that kind of stuff, because the original film stock was incredibly flammable, became a means of censorship, essentially. So the BBFC was kind of set up, and it was a way of sort of sidestepping all the statutory kind of concerns with like state censorship, essentially. So the government didn't have to go hands-on with it. The industry would self-regulate, and they had a bumpy start to start with. And they are notoriously conservative in many respects. They have been throughout history. They have done some things to kind of forward what we can watch, but if you look at it between 1913 and say like 1950s, there was a whole bunch of concerns, particularly like with wartime and all that kind of stuff. But they kind of went through that, and we won't dwell on that sort of point. Come around about the 1960s, they films were starting to change somewhat. All the kind of concerns that the BBFC sort of had before the 1960s were more or less the same kind of things, but there was much, much more lurid versions of that, and that's partly down to the technology of filmmaking and the tastes of the audience. Plus, the American film industry, was absolutely booming, particularly with like the independent sort of stuff and the smaller studio sort of stuff. films like Clockwork Orange and Straw Dogs and all these kind of films were sort of coming in towards the late part of the 60s and into the 70s. Night of the Living Dead as another example. The then president of the BBFC, John Trevelyan, he was kind of a mixed bag, a fascinating guy. Did a really good book called What the Censor Saw. Very, very interesting. They basically, he sort of like saw the tide was turning somewhat with films like Clockwork Orange coming up, and he sort of pieced out, and we had Stephen Murphy came in after that. Stephen Murphy lasted a very short amount of time. He wasn't quite as wily as Trevelyan was by most regards. He tried to continue some of the kind of more progressive kind of approach to censorship and all that kind of stuff, but he was pretty much embattled from day one and didn't last very long. And then after Stephen Murphy came James Furman. James Furman came in at around about the time that, just a bit before, a few years before the Video Nasties sort of happened. So currently, we're sort of back to where we were, more or less. The Video Nasties, the video cassettes, weren't under the same kind of auspices as film in cinemas. So they were kind of in a legal limbo, except they sort of weren't, because they were still subject to the Obscene Publications Act. So, and that's basically the Obscene Publications Act, which I'll talk about a bit later on anyway. That kind of it was a very slow and clunky process, basically, because each individual item had to be kind of prosecuted pretty much. You couldn't you could prosecute like one person at a time, rather than kind of like go, right, this film is banned, therefore everybody. You would have to take each and every one through court. It was kind of a bit crazy, really. So you've seen Publications Act couldn't really cope with it. They had a few prosecutions here and there, and they as the sort of attention shifted onto videos, that accelerated a bit, but there's only so much you can actually get through the court. You've got all your other shit to do as well, so it was not very easy. Now, bear in mind, the kind of material that was coming out on videos, at least originally, in the earlier days, wasn't really kind of mainstream stuff for the most part. The companies, the studios weren't really, particularly like the Hollywood studios, weren't interested in the medium because they felt it was a great way for them to basically lose all their stuff to piracy. And, it's not without some validity, that kind of point of view, but they were so kind of shy of going out there that what filled that void tended to be kind of low budget, small distribution type stuff, and that naturally kind of included a lot of horror, a lot of sex, sort of films that studios wouldn't touch, at least in that kind of style. So a lot of these films started coming out, and they turned out to be quite popular. And, particularly the working class, now that video had sort of become cheap enough to actually be able to be viable for them to participate in, or buying a lot of this kind of stuff, or at least renting a lot of this kind of stuff. So we get to about 1980, and these are the kind of films that are available. I'm gonna... Right, so this is Daily Express, Saturday, December the 20th, 1980. And despite how bad the scan is, it's a bit, these scans are a little bit rough, but this is The Exterminator. Here's Blood in Your Eye. Now, one thing I'm not quite sure about on this particular article, I assume it didn't have... Well, it did have it did go through the BBFC, and there was a lot of complaints about it because of the nature of the film. Some of this stuff came out, but it would have disappeared forever. it would have gone away very much in the early days. So although the BBFC sort of passed this kind of stuff, people were worried, starting to become worried about the fact that this stuff would appear in a way that that children could get hold of. It's an age-old battle cry of just about every form of censorship is, won't you think of the children? Bear in mind, it's the late 70s, early 80s. Thatcher came in 79, 78? So at that time, we were, as a country, Britain was kind of having some problems. There was political problems, financial problems. There was a lot of unrest. There was a lot of strikes. Thatcher comes in and basically kind of sticks the boot into an awful lot of working class kind of institutions. Things like unions and that kind of stuff. She was a big kind of anti-union person. By 1982, there's the Falklands War. Thatcher, by about 1982, was kind of like giving all the kind of law and order rhetoric, trying to bring things under control. So it's like there's a lot of distrust of politicians, of the police. There's a war in the Falklands. There's just riots and unrest, I should say, high crime, race riots, poverty, political exclusion, going on throughout the place. So Britain was not a very happy place at this point, and all these violent films are sort of coming out, and people started to kind of put two and two together and started pointing at things like this rather than policies that had been passed and the general state of the country. Meanwhile, in Sweden, and I don't have much of a reference for this one, unfortunately. It's a very hard part of the video nasties era to actually find an awful lot of information about. We got to this thing going on in Sweden, which is basically a kind of a precursor for the video nasty scare. And there is a list out there. I've got it somewhere. I'm buggered if I know where I put it. But it is almost identical in every respect to the video nasties list that we ended up with. I believe Graham Bright went over. And he was kind of participating in the discussion of all of this kind of stuff. I believe that's where his story about, the Swedish politicians... I tried to show him porn, but he was like, "Hey, no, I'm not interested." All that kind of stuff. So there's that going on, and that model kind of stuck in his head to some degree. Mary Whitehouse eventually got involved, and we should probably talk a little bit about Mary Whitehouse as well. Mary Whitehouse is she was basically a decency campaigner, kind of an evangelical type. A lot of the rallies that they had were very Christian facing. She'd talk about kind of like the decay of moral values and all that kind of stuff, and she eventually got dragged into this. There's a slightly apocryphal story about it was Go Video with Cannibal Holocaust sending that film to her that kind of got her attention, but I think it was a multitude of things that did that. She was primarily interested in like the BBFC, the BBC, and she did have interactions with the BBFC as well. There was kind of fractious between the two, in fact. She was kind of focused mostly on the BBC, and she, long-running feud about kind of Doctor Who and the likes of that. So this is kind of woman she was. An interesting character, if somewhat frustrating, to say the least. And quite mocked for the most part, including, by Tories for the most part. It's only when she became useful that she sort of got brought into the fold, and that was via Graham Bright, apart from anything else, because he saw her as a useful ally, apart from anything else. And the BBFC sort of used her as her kind of as a figurehead for the kind of thing that they were sort of steering towards, but they wanted to steer a little bit more liberally, but it wasn't really by that much. So, up until this point, video cassettes. And I do remember walking down the street, and I've said this before, walking down the street, going to school, I think it was, and this little pop-up video store in someone's living room, essentially. They'd broken out the front wall and made a big window, and there's a bloody great poster of Driller Killer, the infamous one, yeah. So, and I was surreptitiously looking at that photo, like, and it felt kind of naughty to look at it. When you so that's the kind of vibe that there was. There was something felt quite illicit about a lot of these films, as you sort of like went past them, and as you were looking in the video, saw there's always those ones which you sort of look at and go, oh Jesus, that's a little bit, it's a little bit fruity. So all these videos and stuff were only really governed by the Obscene Publications Act, and like I say, that was a very awkward way to actually kind of handle all these things. It was not easy to kind of deal with it, just because of volume and workload and quantity of cases that would end up having to come down the line. And anyone who's ever done like jury service, even on a fairly open and closed case, knows that it's 3 or 4 days for a fairly short case. Could be longer, depends on how good the defence is. So what kind of happened was that Graham Bright basically was looking at the situation. Mary Whitehouse approached him and he proposed the Video Recordings Act. And if I remember rightly, the early version of the Video Recordings Act was included a lot about pornography, right? So, and it's amazing how many people, I say it's amazing, it's actually kind of very typical, how many people in Houses of Parliament looked at that as being an infringement upon civil rights. Like, we shouldn't be telling people they can't watch porn. And that's that's how it was. So the original draft of it was kind of had to be amended from that. So what were they going to go for? Well, what's the least defendable thing? Porn or violence? Fucking or fighting? So violence became the main crusade. And of course, in the video world, like I say, small companies supplying all this stuff actually were putting out stuff that would never pass the BBFC. Although if you look at a lot of the original VHS copies, a lot of them are still clearly pre-cut. So the industry was trying to do something for the most part, but obviously you had things like Cannibal Holocaust coming out, which is it is what it is. It is an absolute balls out horror film. It's pretty disturbing. That, and I wouldn't even say The Evil Dead was particularly disturbing, but for the time, I guess, you could sort of look back at it and go, yeah, I can see why people had a problem with that. If you be a little objective about it. BBFC have the best collections. Maybe they should allow us to see their archives. That's a thing, isn't it? I'm just gonna divert to address that. The BBFC have become a lot harder to actually sort of search on their website. I haven't been on the website for a little while, but I don't think anything's changed. They used to have a lot of records immediately available, including the censorship history. and roughly what cuts were kind of made, at least a rough idea of what was sort of cut. And there's a lot of that information's gone now, which is a real shame. They really dumbed down the site, and I think that was a little unforgivable. Yeah, so where were we? Yeah, the video nasties basically eventually came around because let's have a look at some of the newspapers. So this is in 1980, like I say. So you have like a few, like 1980, 1981. So right here we've got this dangers of porn in the front room and stuff like that. So that's, you know, roughly where the video nasties, the first kind of draft of the bill, sort of came. Yeah. This information, like on here, the Romans under attack, which is actually kind of a national theatre sort of play, but you get a feel for the kind of the times, because even like theatre censorship, it should have been dead and gone in the 60s, but it's sort of quite around. So I think it's the main reason the archive, this archive has that in there, is basically because of it sort of gives you a rough idea of what sort of was going on at the time in terms of how the winds were blowing when it came to censorship. So this is like 1982. 82 is really when it started to kind of pick up speed. Bear in mind, one of the things, as we look through these, one of the things that most people sort of remember about the video nasties, or think that they remember about the video nasties, is that the Daily Mail was the be all and end all of it, and it wasn't. It was all the tabloids, but in fact the Daily Mail was actually quite late to it. This is a fairly decent archive of the newspapers, which I should add is on Book of the Dead. It's a site called Book of the Dead, and they have this entire PDF archive is there. It's well worth popping over and having a look. But obviously from here you start to see what the problem is. You've got the video film kids beat the excerpt, and you can kind of see how the argument is starting to shape up. As always, it ends up being it comes down to the children. Most censorship drives kind of ended up going down this line. So let me just zip down my notes a little bit. And this is... It's an interesting bunch of little articles. They're very, very brief and don't have a heck of a lot of information. But you can see how it's sort of starting to shape up. And this with the female Daily Mail, May 12, 1982, the secret video show. There was a feeling that, because the video, and it's not entirely unjustified, the world of viewing videos is a lot less gated than when you went to the cinema. Not to say that kids did not get to see films at the cinema. James Furman was the president of the BBFC. It's kind of chief censor is just a vague way of... that's not his official role, but yeah. Videos like Roman God Janus has two... video like the Roman God Janus has two faces. On the one hand, it can liberate people from the tyranny of TV schedules and open the door to a vast range of home entertainment. But on the other, it can create problems, and not just for video owners. Actually quite a measured version of what the Mail would actually become. Because now we get to the Times, and Times and the Express were particularly vicious on all of this stuff, really. We go into like how high street horror is invading the home, and they pick kind of several of the The worst examples are Macabre. Yes, it has its moments. It's actually quite a good film, if not a little bit silly at the end, to say the least. But there's that Driller Killer and SS Experiment Camp, and the Nazi exploitation particularly got attention, as did Driller Killer, because of the gory artwork, and the SS Experiment being, evoking a lot of imagery that people felt very uncomfortable with. It was kind of the point. A lot of these films were something of a challenge. When it came to Driller Killer, one of the things about it was because they used that image, it got a lot more attention than it necessarily should have. And it probably shouldn't have been called Driller Killer, really. If they didn't, considering what the film is, it's actually a piece of art house, for God's sake. It's an interesting film. It's actually a genuinely good film. Whereas SS Experiment Camp is a piece of shit. It's just that trashy Nazi exploitation level is really bad. Did these papers consistently call attention to the Nasties, or was it just only a few times a year? They did it enough, and certainly by when we get to about 1983, it was becoming front page stuff. Bear in mind, most of these articles that we've looked at so far have been buried, several pages in, 3, 4, 5, 6 pages in, or more. Sweden was a bad place for censorship in the 1980s. Yes, it's something I kind of found out. I wish I could find an easy way of researching that kind of history, because it's quite difficult to get hold of stuff to read about that's in English. I don't know if Sweden actually has documentation on all that kind of stuff, or whether it's just been kind of consigned to history. So I've got the Express with this poison being peddled as home entertainment. And again, the Nazi exploitation. Graduation Day is such a, even by its time, wasn't particularly outstanding. Speaking of SS Experiment Camp, watched its sister film SS Camp 5, Women's Hell. About as terrible as each other. Yeah, doesn't surprise me. So as we go a bit further down, Watchdog is unleashed on video horror. So there's working parties set up by government to kind of look into these films. And of course, these people didn't really have much knowledge of what was going on with these films. They weren't horror film fans, they're not the sort of people who would get or understand or even enjoy these films in the slightest. In fact, quite the opposite. And it's not to say that there's, some of the films necessarily had something to understand. But like with these two films, you got Cannibal Holocaust and Don't Answer the Phone, which are two films that are like just worlds apart in terms of qualities. Cannibal Holocaust is undoubtedly a disturbing film. But it is a really interesting film as well. It's a serious film. It's not frivolous. Whereas Don't Answer the Phone is what it is. It's kind of an excuse for a bit of on-screen violence. Doesn't have a heck of a lot of a story to it. But all this stuff was getting lumped in together, and because of the imagery that was used in the marketing, they barely looked past the cover. To be fair, there is something to be said about the industry itself. We're not being necessarily very responsible, and they weren't. They were finding their feet as well. Sometimes it was very cynical. That's kind of the nature of the game. It's a competitive business. A lot of these films had to compete with a lot of other films to grab the attention. So, ironically, it's a very market-driven phenomenon, is the video Nasties. So it's kind of like the anti-Thatcherite thing to go after these movies. And bear in mind, the government wasn't really interested at the time, in the early days, in getting involved with censorship. And it was only really because of the political landscape that they started to get involved with that kind of stuff because it became kind of expedient. It helped them to distance all the crap that was going on from them. They could go, oh, look at that awful thing over there, that awful thing. We're going to do something about that. We are. And they would blame these films for causing all sorts of issues, which are, you know, as these stories go on, we'll see. Clean up move for videos. So this is actually kind of interesting because the industry itself was trying to institute kind of self-regulation, sort of like the BBFC in some respects. But it was set up to lose, really. And there's some arguments about whether or not the actual industry was trying to actually do anything seriously. The detractors would say they weren't doing anything, while they'd say they're doing as much as they could possibly do. And the truth is, as always, somewhere in the middle. And as you can see, DPP, the Department for Public Prosecutions. Now, this is the government's wing, you know, legal wing, essentially. They go out and they prosecute on behalf of the government and the country. So when you've got like a big obscenity case where there's no, you know, victim that's necessarily willing to prosecute, the government would prosecute via the DPP. They were starting to get a bit more involved. So you had like the kind of the dirty squad and all that kind of stuff, which is, you know, the obscene publications squad, who would go in and they would kind of eventually sort of find these things and try to prosecute them under the Obscene Publications Act. So we can sort of see here, it's like this is like kind of the early days of all of that going on. And they started to seize videos, yard grab video horror movies. Scene Publication Squad went to Go Video in London's West End, seized copies of SS Experiment Camp, which shows naked women being tortured in a Nazi concentration camp. You know, if you've seen that film, you'll know how pretty weak that film was. It's hello, John. It's a pretty weak film. It's not really, you know, it's not particularly horrific. The effects are kind of weak. The thing that really sort of grabbed people's attention was, I think, more the subject matter, the inclusion of Nazis, the apparent frivolization of history, essentially, is big thing. They found it offensive because of that, much more than they could have possibly found it offensive because of the things that went on in the film. Astra Video lost 300 copies of I Spit on Your Grave. Yeah. And we're starting to see, you know, the list is being formed at this point. The DPP are going after certain titles. They're investigating them and then they're putting them on their list. So we should probably talk about the DPP list a little bit, I guess. This is how they were formed, basically. They would either get complaints or they would go out and they would actively seek for titles that they think were obscene or potentially obscene. They would have to sit down and watch every copy that they seized. This is particularly true because sometimes there were several cuts of the movie, and sometimes a video store might have 2 or 3 different cuts of the movie, depending on which versions you know they picked up. Evil Speak would be, you know, probably a good example of that. There's eventually, you know, 2 different versions of that in this country. But they were picking videos that already had certificates. As well, so BBFC certificated films that were put onto video cassette were also being picked up as part of this thing, and then yeah, they were trying to figure out what the fuck they were doing. Basically, is the crux of the matter. They had no idea. And this is where the OPA really kind of tripped them up, is that they couldn't really keep up with the workload. If you've got like thousands and thousands of cassettes, which are, hour and a half, 2 hours a piece, that's a lot of man hours. Oh dear. Just a quick check on that. So, video nasties to be prosecuted. Prosecution's got distributors of video nasties to horror and terror cassettes, first exposed in the Sunday Times, are to be made this week. So, as it says here, the Director of Public Prosecutions will bring cases under the Obscene Publications Act against at least 3 cassettes, and possibly as many as 6. And I think that is literal. Cassettes, not films, cassettes. Can you imagine? But the list basically was built up of these various prosecutions and attempted prosecutions, and it changed. Titles came and went onto this thing until we've got what is, to give credit to the guy, Mark Morris's compilation is what we generally think of as the Video Nasties list. It would have been different things at different times. And it's not to say that that is necessarily actually definitive, but it's as close to definitive as anyone's got. So the work that guy did on that stuff was incredible. Mark Morris did the definitive guide, Video Nasties definitive guide. I did talk to him once. I sadly pissed him off for doing my Section 3 series. So this is how they dealt with the Video Nasties. Whenever they seized, and basically this would have been under Section 3 or Section 2 of the Obscene Publications Act. Whatever they seized, if it wasn't basically legally argued successfully by the owner that is not the case, then these things would go into an incinerator. And I do wonder how many cassettes kind of went missing during this time and ended up in some constable's apartment. But it's book burning, isn't it? And it kind of really does illustrate the mentality of censorship of art. Is when they start burning it. I mean, it's such a visceral image to see these things being flung into an incinerator. It kind of conjures up the sort of stuff that's on the covers of some of the films that they were throwing in there. Actually thought Beast in Heat was a laugh. It's kind of funny. It is laughably bad, it really is. Kieran really hates Batzella. But, yeah. I imagine the truth of him is probably a little bit convoluted. I'm not going to say he was a great director, but I have seen at least one of his films that was good. So, violent videos are outlawed. This is in 1982. Now, this is basically ones that got prosecuted on the Obscene Publications Act, is what they're talking about here. So, by this point, they've gone for these one by one. So, to some extent, they could pretty much go, no, that's illegal, and they'd have a fairly safe prosecution on their hands from the going forward, because you've got precedent. I do highly recommend, if you want some good reading, this is a really good resource. I mean, it's not the only resource I had either. I know I've actually got more articles by a fair amount than is on this particular one, because I've got a university library I can use, and there's a whole bunch of books I've got, and I found a load of articles from other magazines, including like Sight and Sound and the likes. Nasty Squad jumps in on the hunt for video pirates. Of course, this was the other side of it, and of course, the absence of major labels in the early days opened a market for all the kind of knockoff stuff and the cheap stuff from mostly from the continent, like the Italian exploitation and Euro sleaze and all that kind of stuff. And that was a big chunk of what we had, plus the kind of lower budget sort of small studio offerings from America. But if you wanted the legitimate films, they were a lot more difficult to get hold of in the earlier days. So the Express on October 12th, 1982, children in video peril. And I think, a lot of this kind of time was what really kind of turns my stomach about what I like to call journalese. The way headlines are constructed. I mean, it's got so bad these days. I sometimes have to read the headline 3 or 4 times to actually understand what the fuck they're talking about. In this article, they talk about an NSPCC study, which is the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. It's a charity, ostensibly, you would imagine, pretty benign, very noble in intent and all that kind of stuff. But when you actually look into the history of how they got into the political side of stuff, including film censorship and all that kind of stuff, they made some pretty potty decisions. It had to be said. I love this little bit from this article. It says a video film could be hired for only £2 a night, and children were clubbing together to raise the money. Again, it's always kids, because they can't get away with using this kind of language in terms of adults as much. They do in some extent, but usually when they're criminals and they've been corrupted. But for the most part, it's kids, because who doesn't want to protect kids? And if you're anti-protection of kids, then you must be a bad person. It's the sacred cows when it comes to censorship. That's what they hide behind, because you can't be in opposition to protecting the innocent. Doesn't matter what your reasoning is, they will just go, yeah, you hate children, or you want children to be corrupted. It's like the language of this era. It's reflected in a lot of today's stuff as well. When you look at like stuff about the internet, as a for instance, you get a lot of the same rhetoric. So I just trying to check the chat there. I love that article. Storm over sex book for 7-year-olds. Does that sound familiar? I mean, America has been going through a lot of this stuff at the moment, with a lot of books being banned in schools and stuff like that. America, land of the free, and they're banning books. And I do know the arguments, and most of them are bullshit. So we have like kind of discussion of the video certification system. Now, this is prior to the BBFC getting necessarily directly involved in it, but they were in talks with the government. But the BVA were basically trying to do what the BBFC did and self-regulate to some extent. But however far they went, it was never going to be enough, and they basically got kind of sabotaged, and the BBFC stole the business, to say the least. America has the extreme left teaching kids about their sex lives right now. That's not really, that's not a very nuanced way to look at the problem. There's a lot of hysteria going on. It's about protect the kids, and I do know the arguments that have been put out there. But yeah, we have got that the same kind of issues. Basically, it's conservatism via versus liberalism. In a less liberalism is a very difficult thing to kind of like discuss these days, because the meaning of it has been kind of corrupted by a lot of things, but we can't really go into that because that's quite a complicated subject, but it's not what I would have regarded as liberalism necessarily. So when it came to kids watching videos, it's like, did they watch them? There's a lot of arguments sort of for and against that as a position. I think undoubtedly some kids did watch some films that they shouldn't have watched. It was very difficult, I think, for parents to understand what it was that the kids would potentially be watching, because there wasn't a classification system. And I am actually kind of, pro-classification in terms of customer information, so you know what it is you're getting. Film censorship tends to be something I would regard as needs to be kind of carried out to comply with the law. I.e. things like one of the ones that you can't really argue against, well, you can, but is cruelty to animals and stuff like that is one thing that is illegal. Therefore, if you do that on film for real, then you're basically, profiting from a crime. And that's where a lot of censorship for the BBFC actually, is based, is in those kind of laws. That and the sensibilities of the general public as they've managed to read them. But you got like the times with like protection from video films. It's like, like you've got to go out and get these things. It's a little ridiculous, really. I'm not going to say that there wasn't any kind of problem, because there potentially was. Video hiring wasn't necessarily done with the most sort of diligence in mind. So if a kid went into the right shop, they would be able to get out Drill a Killer or something like that, as a for instance. So there had to be a little bit of consideration which was given to that. It was kind of the Wild West when it came to video rentals in the earlier days, to say the least. Not least that, there would be, shall we say, under-the-counter films. And I believe, actually, one guy had a V2000 copy of, I think it might have been Eaten Alive. And or Cannibal Ferox. And this thing had been like, nobody had a V2000 by the time this guy got caught for it. It was like an old copy, and he hadn't thrown it away, and the police came in and busted him for it, despite the fact there was next to nobody who could actually play the damn thing. This is one of the more iconic Daily Mail articles. We must protect our children now. This is really kind of like where the Daily Mail kind of began being particularly vicious, and they really did. They absolutely kind of went full bore on it. Where the Express and the likes, they were kind of this sort of tone, but they tended to be smaller articles, kind of hidden away. This is a near full page article. And the language that they use kind of evolved over time into sort of like literally talking about the video nasties as kind of a drug, very much literally akin to cocaine and the likes. That people would get hooked on them. People would be corrupted physically and mentally by these films. Almost as if it's like the fucking videos from Videodrome, So, an Overton window for nasties. It's kind of interesting to track that over the years. Yeah, I think it'd be an interesting thing to track that over the years. Bear in mind, a lot of the people that were renting videos back then wouldn't have got necessarily Cannibal Holocaust out. You know, it's pretty clear what a lot of the videos were. There is a classic example of the police seizing Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, which is Burt Reynolds and Dolly Parton musical. It's a very frivolous little film, and they picked it up off of the shelves because they thought it was pornography. Faces of Death was my first. We only watched because they said we shouldn't. Yes, I remember watching Faces of Death a long time ago, and I must say that challenged me at the time. It was not an easy film to sit through. Of course, you know, with newer eyes and more accustomed eyes, you can see the joins on something like that, can't you? You can see what was real and what wasn't. And of course, this is a really good example is Faces of Death, because it got taken through Parliament in, you know, people talked about it in Parliament like it was entirely real. It was only a small percentage of it was real. And when it was real, it was kind of very rough footage. You didn't really see much of anything. But you'd been so kind of primed by all the fake stuff that you probably saw more than you actually did, if you get what I mean. So this one, it's a Mary Whitehouse kind of kicking in. And bear in mind, we're about mid 1983 at this point. Storm over Video Nasties on Channel 4. And Channel 4 did a documentary which had a few clips and stuff from the Video Nasties discussing the issues around it. And Mary Whitehouse objected to that. She was quite vocal about it. I wish I could find a copy of that programme. It's yeah, some of those programs is actually kind of fascinating. There's one where Sam Raimi was basically interviewed in front of a live audience about Evil Dead and stuff like that. It's kind of funny. Faces of Death is one of the few prosecuted Section 2 titles that I've yet to see. One of the stuff doesn't interest me. Faces of Death is kind of interesting in some respects. It does actually have a point, although it's arguable about kind of, you know, how substantive that point is. But it does have it has a narrative, so it's kind of interesting. This young glue sniffers should be arrested. That was the big drug of the day for the kids. It's super glue. Wow. Schoolboys who buy porn with their dinner money. I mean, it was just this massive moral crusading which sort of went on. It was particularly with the Mail. The Mail was incredibly evangelical about all this sort of stuff. Very prudish in some respects. Just about every issue had some complaint about, you know, liberal media of one kind or another. And certainly during the Video Nasties scare, it just got worse and worse and worse and worse. So bearing in mind, we're getting to the point where Graham Bright has kind of introduced the Video Recordings Act. The first draft of that included, like I say, adult entertainment, and it was basically shot down on liberal grounds. It shouldn't be dictating the tastes of adults and all that kind of stuff. So there was a few Tory MPs particularly that were kind of watching porn and stuff like that, and they didn't want that taken away from them. But horror, oh, well, they didn't like horror. So there was nothing valuable about it. Legal bid on TV Nasties, so that's more about that programme called out A Gentleman's Agreement. And I wish I could find it, like I say. Faces of Death proudly boasted that the film would never get passed by the BBFC. No, and there was a lot of talking. And funny enough, the discussion in Parliament about Faces of Death was it's kind of hilarious because they keep going on about stuff like the monkey brain scene, and a couple of scenes which in it are, known to be reconstructions, shall we say, and not a single lick about the real stuff. So they always homed in on the fake stuff because that's the showiest bit. Video Nasties go ahead. So gentleman's agreement actually kind of got through. So this is the point now, June 28th, 1983, that we've got the Daily Mail outright blaming crimes on videos. Not poverty, not social circumstances, not mental health. They're just looking at these nasty, nasty crimes and going, that's the videos, that is. Not a lick of evidence. They go, oh, well, these people watch these things. And you sort of go, violent people will kind of seek out violent entertainment. It's not the cause. It's kind of this thing that they're attracted to. But, yeah. Faces of Death is crude, but it's better made than most mondos that followed. Yeah, I'd probably give you that. Yeah. It's actually not a terrible film. It's hard to watch. It's grim and gruesome, but it does have a narrative. I actually legitimately do class that as a mondo, rather than kind of this pseudo mondo. Yeah, oh god, I forgot. Bloody Yorkshire Ripper around that time as well. So bloody hell. Sadistic Video still openly on sale, and this is like mid 1983. Many dealers complain we can't get proper guidance. This was actually a big part of the Video Nasties scare, that the dealers really had no idea what the fuck they were allowed to and not allowed to actually stock. It was a big issue. The DPP was not helping because there was a lot of dialogue between the BVA, British Videogram Association, and the DPP in order for the BVA to actually get information from them about what it is they shouldn't be stocking, because they were trying to avoid prosecutions. They weren't going to tell somebody absolutely no, you cannot get this, but they would give out advice to the various people, say, look, these videos are likely to get you into trouble, you probably want to take them off your shelves. But I think the DPP was, they were keen to make a show of a lot of this stuff. They were very, very eager, to say the least. Kieran, the Mail was a daily thing. It's a Daily Mail. No, it's every day. It's a tabloid newspaper. So, every day. 7 days a week. So yeah, they had a real problem, and the government, the authorities were not trying to help. And I don't know if partly it was because they didn't want to get sued for having something on the list that shouldn't be there, because they could potentially have gotten sued for that. There is a temptation in some regards for them to just go, no, we want to get as many prosecutions as possible. But their workload was so high anyway, and all they needed really was a few high-profile cases. Something they can make some noise about, because you ain't going to make noise about several thousand cases where you could about 10 or 20. And a very typically understated article, editorial from the Daily Mail, the rape of our children's minds. They went so big into the children thing, and it's just like, the second anybody kind of argued against that, it's like, you're anti-child, it's just ridiculous. And these are the kind of newspapers that would kiss the arse of Jimmy Savile, despite, what was known about him, even at the time. Daily Mail's produced for those who can't read. I think it's more that they can't think, but, yeah. Ban video sadism now. And, of course, this is the front page. And bear in mind, the Daily Mail really did start taking credit for the Video Recordings Act being pushed through. Now, despite the fact it was largely Mary Whitehouse, and the thing is, Mary Whitehouse was mocked, even by the likes of the Mail, for the longest time. Mary Whitehouse was kind of a comical figure to many. She wasn't really taken that seriously, least of all by the Tories. The Tories did not like her. And partly it was because there was this sort of anti-liberal sort of thing. I mean, you would describe Thatcher's Britain as being libertarian. Extremely libertarian. I mean, they really did kind of, along with Reagan, they kicked off the neoliberal era. And she was more kind of libertarian when it came to financial things. Really, when you're talking about the economy and businesses and stuff, which is why she sold off a lot of state assets along the way, because she wanted to privatise everything, because she felt that the free market was the way to go. And look what that's done for us. She was trying to do it with the NHS, and a lot of governments, particularly the Tory governments, have been trying to do that with the NHS since, the 70s. 17th of October 1983, Evil Dead was 16 in the rental charts, yes. Thing was at 2, Evil Speak was 37, Electric Blue, yes. Yes, I remember the Electric Blue videos. I never watched one, but I do remember them being around. It was a bit like kind of, okay. Market deregulation, privatisation, etc. Look at it all now. Yes, absolutely. But the tone of the Daily Mail is really what got its attention. They were quite strident, to say the least. And there's this thing going around as the Video Recordings Act was being sort of pushed. There was a film reel that was made up between the NVLA, which is Mary Whitehouse's lot, so the National Viewers and Listeners Association, and Graham Bright, and they showed this to Parliament, and it was basically snippets of the worst parts that they could find of any given films, out of context, back to back, whatever, 5-10 minute reel, whatever it was. And then they wonder why, these kind of stuffy politicians walked out feeling grossed out, and feeling a bit shell-shocked. It's because they don't watch that kind of stuff. And, of course they're going to react to it like that. One of the things about the Obscene Publications Act is that it's supposed to take the item that's considered obscene and look at it as a whole. To figure out whether or not it's got context and all that kind of stuff. That is actually quite a cleverly crafted part of the OPA. So it allows for certain things to be shown in certain contexts, but be less exploitative. So if you were just to kind of like show sex and nudity, and that's all the context was, it becomes pornography. There were routes for that to be classified, but generally speaking, it would be rejected by the BBFC for regular consumption. However, if you have that same sex and nudity in a different context, it's an artistic concept, it's part of the story, it's justified by the story, all that kind of stuff, then then it's legally not obscene, as long as you can justify it. Which is, incidentally, why in America, porn films during the golden era of porn had stories, because then you could legally justify it, basically, because you can say it's part of the story. You might not like the story, you might think the story's crap, but it's part of a story. So why we've got narratized pornography back in the day. which most people these days would just find incredibly tedious. Still need to see Dead End Street. Yes, it's an interesting little film. There's talk of banning Death Wish 2 back in the early 80s. Yes. Yeah, Death Wish was thought to be incredibly violent. Buying into the sex and horror business. Again, you know, they're sort of basically compounding the two together, basically. Compounding them as being part of the same thing, different sides of the same coin. 2 seconds. Yeah. Mo beer. Same rhetoric all at humanities ills were due to films, video games, etc. It's funny, the history of censorship is really heavily focused on a couple of things, really. Mostly it's the youth, but it's also youth culture. So be it comic books, be it TV programs, films, computer games, the internet. You can follow the history of censorship through the various methods of media production, be it the printing press, the first films, radio, comic books, all those kind of things. Whatever was aiming itself towards youth culture in any kind of means is basically it was fair game. And usually it's because the people who would make those kind of decisions really didn't understand that particular media. And it's just as true in America as it is in any other country, despite the whole kind of, you know, we've got freedom of speech and resistant to government censorship and all that kind of stuff, you know. You don't have to release your film through the MPAA. That kind of stuff, those kind of arguments don't really hold water because there are financial pressures on companies to have to go through the route of censorship, and it's deliberately crafted so it's very, very difficult to release a film as unrated and still have anybody be able to buy it. It's very, very difficult. I've noticed that the earlier articles were further into the paper. Ones in '83 were front and centre on, or in the first 5 pages. Yes, yeah, it was kind of buried originally, and it's only really when you get to about 1981, late 81 and early 82, that video itself sort of started to come into specifically as the focus to the actual kind of cassette, you know, as opposed to the film, because they recognised the sort of medium and that it was kind of open to this kind of stuff. So yeah, yes, they did. The Daily Mail campaign banned the sadist videos. They did use this image a lot. So that's Eaten Alive, actually. Yeah, actually no, it's Cannibal Holocaust. So yeah. They did use that a lot. I mean, it's a lurid image, but again, it's a very Thatcherite kind of thing. That, you know, the kind of business liberalism that she kind of espoused should have allowed for that kind of stuff. And I'll reiterate that, you know, originally the government wasn't interested in getting into film censorship. They were quite resistant to it, in fact. And it's only when this new technology came along and eventually they just kind of went, actually, it's quite useful to us. Because bear in mind, 1982, we're currently here in 1983. 1982 was the Falklands War. And there was all the violence and, you know, several high-profile murderers which were going around at those kind of times, and some particularly egregious crimes, very nasty crimes that went on. plus civil unrest and all that kind of stuff. And it was a very useful way to rattle the keys in front of people and sort of distract them from the real things that the government was doing. They got away with a lot because they basically went, look what we're doing about these nasty video cassettes. You know, it's like, it was an easy target at the end of the day. It didn't take much for them to actually sort of pass it, because when you look at the Hansard notes, and Hansard notes, for those who don't know, Kieran, you should look into those. Hansard notes, basically, HANSARD, are transcriptions of debates in the Commons and House of Lords, right? And you could do a proper search on them. They're actually quite very, very easily searchable. So you can find various debates that went on. You can find the original readings of the Video Recordings Act and the debates that went on and all that kind of stuff. So you can see the evolution of this argument as it goes along, but you can also see that anybody who argued against complete censorship by about midway through the discussion was basically kind of vilified. They were called all sorts of things. One thing about British Parliament particularly is it's quite robust when it comes to arguments. Other than bad language, they were really rude to each other. So there was all sorts of accusations, you know. It's like, if you're not with us, then you must be one of these people that support this kind of filth, you know. So there's this sort of weird British civility to the way that they put most of it, but it was actually quite vicious. But if you're ever looking into British law making, i.e. through the Houses of Parliament and House of Lords, the Hansard notes are a really, really invaluable tool for research. In fact, my Video Nasties finale, the first section of it, which is in 2 parts because I couldn't upload more than 15 minutes at a time, a lot of that contains information that was gleaned from things like the Hansard notes, including a couple of quotes that one of the quotes that's at the beginning. Was it Lord Horton of Sowerby? I think it was. Yes, Lord Horton of Sowerby. Which is actually a really interesting one, because he was one of the few, I should say, voices that argued about the risks of censorship. Never since 1843 have we had a bill for pre-censorship of a means of communication. This is an important bill on that account. It comes very close to being a constitutional bill. If we had written a constitution and if we had a Bill of Rights, I'm quite sure that freedom of pre-censorship of communication would be part of it. Which I think is a very powerful statement. But when you look further on into that discussion, he basically gets slandered quite badly by other MPs who essentially kind of argue that, you know, he is against protecting children, that he's misguided, that he must be deluded, all that kind of stuff. Meanwhile, the reality of the UK is pretty easy to witness, and any attempt to hoodwink people will only last for so long. Yeah. Yes, Kieran, yeah. Very, very interesting. If you ever really want to get into the weeds, and it is something I've been kind of trying to do over the last few years, is do a definitive political look at the process that happened, both in the media and actually in the House of Lords and House of Parliament, because it is fascinating, and to see the degree to which people were kowtowed, you know, any opponents to the bill were kowtowed and beaten down, browbeaten, is amazing, especially when they say something like that, which is a very reasonable thing. That quote I just read, it's a very reasonable thing to say. And seeing the press's response to stuff like that, if they reported even those objections, if they did report them, it would absolutely just go to town on those people. But yeah, it's an interesting headline, that one. That's one of the ones that Josh Hadley quoted when we did the video Nasties thing. It was a little bit of a misquote in some respects, because it's only a small part of that. I probably should have sent it to him, but yeah. A mother's anguish. Now, this is a case of Martin Austin, who basically, his crime, sex crime, basically against a woman. The mother blamed Miyazaki of I Spit on Your Grave as being the cause for her son's behaviour, which is, while I sympathise with her pain, which is not an easy thing to go through, is to have, having a son that do that kind of stuff. It's incredibly misguided. And they actually met. They got interviewed together. So we've got to the point now where Graham Bright, Conservative MP for Luton South and Parliamentary Private Secretary to the two Home Office ministers, announced last night that he would present a private members' bill to outlaw pornographic, obscene and horror tapes. So this is really the first draft of the Video Nasties, well, not Video Nasties, the Video Recordings Act, right? Like I say, it focused a lot on sex stuff, because he had a real beef with pornography, and this is where Mary Whitehouse, and him were kind of on the same page. Even he didn't want to go quite as far as she did in some respects, but yeah. One thing about Graham Bright, though, is I do believe he was sincere about what he was talking about. Mary Whitehouse, I'm not quite so sure these days. I think she liked the attention, apart from anything else. I think she did believe it to a great extent, although I don't think she was averse to a little bit of hyperbole. See, this is one of the things as well. Bear in mind that the video shares shock. Miners' pension fund bought into firm supplying Nasties. It's kind of one of those things that the mines were obviously under attack by Margaret Thatcher back in the day. There was a lot of strikes involving miners. As the mines kind of got closed down one by one, a lot of those guys used whatever their basically their severance was, and went and opened up a video store, because it was a booming business and anybody could do it. It was a very relatively low investment kind of business. You could start relatively small and build up. The cassettes were quite expensive, but it was relatively easy to do, because all you needed was a few shelves and a bit of stock. Then you'd work out the whole kind of hiring thing, right? So it does highlight to some extent the class warfare that was going on with the Tories as well. They didn't really think much of working class people. That much was clear. We were getting in the way. I say we. The working class people were getting in the way, basically, of what she wanted to do. And she was selling off, public utilities left, right and centre, which belonged to the people, not to her. So, yeah, you got all this kind of stuff going on. But you got this link between kind of the miners and Video Nasties. Whether that was a driving force, I don't think it was specifically, but it was just... It must have felt like getting kicked when you were down. I'm hoping I'm not coming down with a cold. Excuse if I sniffle a little bit. Video sadists and respectable dupes. So, Too easy to blame the backstreet filth merchants. It's very non-judgmental language there. Video sadism would not have had the hold it does on our young if it did not also have some very respectable, albeit unwitting, backers. Have you bought a video? Do you know? Do you want to know what your children watch on it when you're out? The Daily Mail. Oh my God. Bright's name was kind of ironic. Yeah, you could. I can't bring it in myself to absolutely hate the guy, although I think he was a bit of a buffoon. He's a very differing kind of very classically British middle class politician. Oh, and we get the horror. Oh, the horror. Pledged by the video bosses, we will replace all the film's lustier rates. To talk about pissing in the wind. Youth killed after a video session. Man of 22 killed a youth after they watched a video film, a QC told a court yesterday. He watched a film. Oh my God, that must have been it. He ate his dinner that day. That must have been it. Oh, he had some breakfast. Oh, it must have been the coffee that he had in the morning. And here you go. I mean, it's more, again, it's more of this idea that the movies were responsible for the crimes. It's a little bit ridiculous, isn't it? Right, I'm just going to blow my nose, so I'm just going to mute my mic a second. I'll just go back to that second. There we go. Didn't want to do that right in front of the microphone. That would have been desperately unpleasant. But yeah. So we've got this kind of idea that the movies cause the crime rather than the criminals seek out the movies. Yeah. Cart before the horse. But of course it's the Daily Mail again. And again, it's they really kind of like pounded it so hard, this whole kind of argument, really bad. And it's no wonder that people sort of think of, when they think of the video nasties, they think of the Daily Mail, because they were the most vocal. They were really out there. Like, it didn't start with them, and that's one of the things that people tend to mistake. Don't forget Falklands, Russia told. Cold War, ladies and gentlemen. Russia was warned yesterday that Britain will not hesitate to defend itself if attacked. The Soviets are reminded of what happened to Argentina over the Falklands. Yeah, we had nukes hanging over us as well. That really kind of, diffused tensions. And they were worried about bloody horror films. Leon Britton basically gets in on the fight. And the thing is, it's like I say, initially, the Tory party weren't particularly sold on this whole thing. Graham Bright wasn't really, highly regarded. He was a private secretary, for one thing. So he wasn't like kind of right out there on the battlements with the rest of the guys. But as it became kind of convenient as an excuse, really, they began to jump on board, and eventually Maggie Thatcher herself was kind of making statements about it. It's really kind of brought in the useful idiots. Lots of editorials and kind of like comments and stuff like that were kind of appearing by this point. Oh yes, a bit of Cold War era coxswain. Yes. Well, there's a reason why Russia hates us, as a country, in a political kind of sense. There's a reason why Putin and his cronies and the Soviets and of the world basically kind of, I usually name the UK as being the first thing that they hate about the West. Over and above America, it's kind of extraordinary. We've given them a hard time over the years. Basically, because we sort of stand there and go, fuck you. A video nasty killer. There you go. Yet another one. Kenneth Smart. Kenneth Smart, 23, murdered his best friend after seeing horror films in which his particular sexual fantasies were acted out. It's always about perversion and a kind of like a drug-fueled sort of analogy that they use. I never realised that the movies were as violent and horrific, and it has to be said that most people hadn't been exposed to movies with that kind of level of violence in them. But it's not unique. There were films, you can look at a lot of legitimate films throughout film history that certainly challenged the audiences to an equal level. Eyes Without a Face is a pretty gory film when it comes down to it. It's not an easy watch. It's quite uncomfortable and quite shocking. But they talk about this stuff like it's brand new, and a lot of it's down to availability, I guess, because, like I say, the films weren't generally available in the cinema, and of course, when you're in the cinema, it went through the whole process, and you could only really get to watch them once or twice. So very, very different. Do you think the Daily Mail might not be above kind of exaggerating? Reading some of these headlines, Daily Mail, do you think Boy George read them? No, probably not. But they're always there. I mean, particularly in the 80s, the tabloids were absolutely appalling. When you got the Sun or the Express moralising about stuff, and the Sun's got his page 3 models, tits every day, page 3. It's like, and they'll stand there and wag their finger at you. It's like, oh my god. Ah, dear. I mean, we're getting to the point now, which is, this is some of the proposals of £10,000 fine for video nasties and stuff like that. Which is, it's a lot of money these days. It was a heck of a lot of money back then. All the same. Oh, my head is absolutely full this evening. Charity shock from King of the Nasties. So, I'm trying to think if this was the guy that did, I think it's Astra Video, if I remember right. But yeah, they're bad when they give to charities as well, because it's the guy that sold I Spit on Your Grave, which is actually a really good film in my opinion. Actually shockingly unexploitative in many respects. The second half of the movie is exploitation, the first is not. Taken over by something evil from the TV set. Now, if I remember rightly, that Martin Barker and Kieran, this is one of the books I recommended to you, which is Video Nasties: Freedom in Censorship in the Media. That freedom of censorship in the media. That was one of the images that he talked about in an in an article. Bear in mind that a lot of the discussions that was going on at the time, there were the occasional voices, sometimes in Parliament, although they were shouted down, and also out in the media as well. So Martin Barker is one of those voices. As a for instance, there were a couple of critics who stood up for freedom of expression in film and stuff as well, but they were tended to get sort of shouted down. That image is one of the ones that Martin Barker that basically cited as kind of inspiration for him to do his book, I believe. He says he did remember quite clearly seeing that. It's like, yeah, like how they just state horror films with a trigger based on not much of anything. No, this is the thing. It's like this one. Video rapist was set free on bail. You know, so what was the problem? Was it the films, or was it the fact that he was walking the streets? You know, if the films didn't exist, this guy would have not done what he was doing. You know, it's ludicrous. These arguments that they came up with were, you know, just quite extraordinary. Hooking of the video junkies. Now, this is another one which is quite significant in my mind, because this is the point where they really started kind of angling on the drugs side, because, you know, for whatever reason, maybe they felt they'd overplayed their hand a bit with the it causes crime, or it's going to make your little boys into bad little boys. They're also implying that, you know, there's cognitive effects of these things, that the desensitization will cause you to be an evil person based on nothing. You know, they cite a lot of studies and stuff like that. The NSPCC, I believe, did at least one study which was dubious to say the least, but there was another which I believe comes up in just a little while. Apparently a boy of 15 developed a deep personality disorder after watching a series of video nasties. He began to suffer from a condition known as night terrors. It's a bit ridiculous, to say the least. I mean, they're quoting a doctor who's calling for stricter controls on the films. You know, I mean, it's not to say that films can't have an effect on a kid. I give them nightmares, that kind of stuff. You know, even with adults, it can cause that kind of stuff. But the weight of the evidence that they have is generally so kind of low, and usually kind of apocryphal as well. You know, it's not, there's not a lot of depth to the story. They clearly don't really sort of go into learning about, you know, what was the state of the mind of the boy before he started watching these kind of things. Were there any other circumstances? It's like with James Bolger, which happened, you know, later, that the kids watched, you know, Child's Play, and that's what caused them to be evil. And as you learn more about those two lads, what their upbringing was like, you start to realise that, you know, there's far more significant things than this. Did they watch that film? Maybe, maybe not. There was never any evidence that they actually did. But all the other stuff that was going on, the broken families and lack of supervision, and their lifestyle, the homes they came from were troubled, to say the least. But it's that movie. It's that movie that caused it, you know. And that's how they are. I mean, the newspapers are pretty goddamn weak. Ah, dear. The tide of evil. It's a lot of that kind of stuff which goes on. A vile harvest of the porn peddlers. Again, they're the kind of movies that they're sort of talking about. And the thing is, it's like I say, with porn and the discussion about it in Parliament, the ministers themselves were rejecting that. No one's going to watch a 90-minute movie and decide to go on a bloody rampage with axes and chainsaws now. I don't think they will. Not generally. I mean, you've got to have something, problematic with you before, It's like a lot of crimes that, get blamed necessarily on alcohol, violence. Somebody gets violent because of alcohol, but it's usually other things which kind of contribute to it before as well. It's not always the case, but... SAC DPP demand after sex cases dropped. Anti-porn campaigner Mary Whitehouse called yesterday for the Director of Public Prosecutions to be replaced after a decision to drop charges against Liberal peer Earl Grey and 4 other men linked to a sex shop empire. More kids in Curtie. TV nasties. TV nasties. So what did they watch? It just says video nasties. Films included Cat People, a story of a man who cuts up a woman after having sex with them. Ah, dear. It says something about the people, though, doesn't it, that run that place. That they don't vet that stuff in a place that's got vulnerable children in it. So this is that article of the mother, Martin Austin's mother, and Miyazaki. I mean, he sort of defends himself within it. He's like, no, I don't really, honestly, I don't believe. He tried, from what I can tell, to be very sympathetic and kind, but she obviously, there's a certain amount of denial going on there, I think. They banned a horror film called Mikey around the same time about a boy that goes on a rampage. Yes, I did a commentary track for that with Josh Hadley. Interesting one, actually, because it had actually been given a certificate by the BBFC, but because it had to go through the video packaging review committee before it would get the final tick from the BBFC. It happened over the time, basically over the holidays, and James Bolger was killed during that time, and they didn't get the certificate for the video packaging till after that, by which time the BBFC got, we can't allow you to have that. We're not going to give you the license. So they were unfortunate. Didn't one of them mention the Ghost Train track and blue painting Child's Play? Yes, they did. There was a lot of that kind of thing going on. They basically tried to make as many links as possible, and it had so little to do with anything. There was a rather unfortunate element of that crime involving batteries, and they were speculating on whether did they think they could bring him back to life by putting new batteries in and shit like that. It's like, no, they were just being little bastards, basically. They saw the kid more in the same way that kids would regard like a dead animal. From what I can tell, it is pretty cruel. I mean, it's not to say that, I wouldn't defend them. What they did was massively awful. But to blame films is so trite and actually quite dangerous. So here we got the Nasties show MP walkout. So this is when they showed the MPs the show reel, shall we say, the highlights reel. Which is quite funny because not only were they kind of like, these posh twats and stuff like that, kind of like subjected to watching sort of I Spit on Your Grave and little shots of Faces of Death and things like that, which they're just not used to. They were just like kind of like blasted this stuff at them, and apparently a whole bunch of them walked out, and some of them said they felt quite ill, and I'm kind of glad they got tortured a little bit. But it just shows you how naive they were, you know, when it comes to that kind of stuff. Nauseated MPs walk out on Video Nasty show. So this was a combination of Graham Bright and Mary Whitehouse coming up with this thing. And eventually they took it to Europe as well. They tried to spread the word across the EU, and some countries took them more seriously than others. Porn dodges video ban. Soft porn films are to be spared from the purge on the Video Nasties. This is what I'm saying. So the first reading, basically, they rejected it on those front. They felt it was interfering with an adult's choice. To which you could say, well, what about the children? They can just grab these things and watch them. Dear oh dear. Just shows you the times we've got Syria in the news there as well. Not much changes. Not much changes. We must outlawed the hard porn. Lord Lane, the Lord Chief Justice, last night joined a growing campaign to censor pornography and video nasties. Where he's a bit late, really, because the lawmakers had already rejected that. It was just the video nasties. Again, because it was horror. Yeah, horror. What's the value of horror? Can't see the video nasties being taken seriously in France. I don't know, to be honest with you. I mean, France was always much more liberal on sex and stuff, but violence, I think, probably has a harder time. Gunman Jack's a baby. Good Lord. Maggie backs the ban on sadist videos. So, after the first failed attempt at the Video Recordings Act, Margaret Thatcher herself got on board. Good bit of PR for her at the time. Easy battle. You know, it's not a lot for her to lose. Even if she lost, it would be like, well, at least I tried. But it wasn't her bill. In fact, you know, Graham Bright, to some extent, was a very easy stooge to put up there, because he didn't really have, you know, a very prominent parliamentary career before he took this on. He had to give up his job to actually sort of take the bill as far as he did. So he took a risk to actually do that, but a lot of politicians wouldn't have. Because it's too easy for that to sort of have blowback to some extent if it all went tits up and then you just went, right, you're kid, the other guys that tried to put state censorship in, which would have been a bad look. More about Maggie kind of thrusting herself into this thing. I don't know what video that was. Yeah, there's a couple of articles on that. So post that screening, the Video Recordings Act was kind of amended, and basically the point was it was going to go through the BBFC now. Everything, any cassette that you were going to sell had to go through the BBFC, with a few exceptions. When we get to the end of this, and we're sort of not far off the end of the main thrust of this. Basically, we'll have a quick look at the OPA and the VRA. Communist Party moving back towards Moscow. Okay. Oh, how times haven't changed. So Graham Bright basically looking for jail sentences for video nasty sellers. Which potentially he would get his way with the VRA. So as you can see, they took the video reel and took it around Europe, went on its tour, international tour. I would like to see kind of like some of the politicians from Europe just go, death. Fuck off. But they would have been facing to some degree the same sort of thing. Sweden, like you say, was kind of one of the prototypes for the video nasties. So, yeah, some of them would have been very receptive. But the idea of the British coming over to European continent and telling them what they should and shouldn't be watching was probably not lost for its humour on some people, I would imagine. Hope the compilation included a funny 30-second slow-mo scream from David Hess in House and Furniture. Have I got news for you? Ever mentioned the Nasties back in the 90s? I honestly don't know. I wouldn't have thought so. However, there was the revival of the video nasties kind of era in the 90s as well. So they probably had something to say on that. Labour revolt on video nasties. Labour MP... This is the Mail again, yeah. Labour MPs threatened last night to block the new laws against video nasties in retaliation for government killing off a bill to help the disabled. Maggie Thatcher, ladies and gentlemen. Maggie Thatcher. The fucking Tories. Jesus Christ. Sadism for 6-year-olds. And this is another thing where the image that the Mail kind of projected of basically video nasty parties. So kids all sort of have, instead of having like the conjurer or the clown at a party, they would just have sick videos. Before video, it was books and banned pornographic literature from France. See, this is the thing, isn't it? It's like, like I say, it always follows kind of like the current technology, be it books or be it radio or whatever, music, rape of children, of young minds. Right, so this is getting to the point where you've got the parliamentary committee, basically. Just check my notes. It is the Parliamentary Group Video Inquiry, which was led by Dr. Clifford Hill. I got quite a few notes there. So basically, this is referring to that. And the figures are quite weird, to say the least. This particular this survey that they did, even the people that were carrying it out, with the exception of the person who was leading it, said that it all got kind of taken out of context. It wasn't a particularly well conducted survey. It wasn't even particularly representative. The control methods weren't very good. And it's like somebody else, and I can't remember his name off the top of my head, god damn it, carried out a similar kind of experiment. And he says what you need to do is you need to put in kind of a list of fake titles, and you discuss it with the children. What did you like about this film? You saw this film. What did you like about it? And they would almost always, very, very often at least, sort of point out films that they hadn't seen, and they would just make it up. And that was one of the problems with this particular survey, was it didn't have those kind of control methods to try to kind of verify the information that they were getting. Because kids say that they've seen films. Because it's, oh yeah, I heard that there was that one with the cannibals and it did this and that and the other, and it turns out they haven't actually watched anything. They've just heard somebody talking about it, or it was in the goddamn news. And there's, kids brag on the playground, so they hear these things, and it's completely and utterly unrepresentative when that last person down the Chinese whisper line says that they saw this particular thing. I love the descriptions of what they got as well. Cannibalica's sickening contents reveal a terrifying catalogue of death among cannibal tribes. Wow. So this is the survey. Basically, the results of that survey was that essentially 40% of children had been watching video nasties, and it was utter bollocks. And as it goes along, the numbers got bigger. So it was 50% at a later point. So it's like this. The Nasties generation, I like him when the killer puts a drill through him and he screams. I mean, it's so vague, and they could describe anything, but they've just heard the word drill a killer, and they've just come up with it. You know, wow. Children turned on by TV horror. That's a little bit kind of out there. Evil video violence. But the guilty parents, now they're blaming the parents, which, you know, parents should be kind of careful about what they have in the house. If you had a pornographic magazine, you wouldn't leave it out on the bookshelf. But, you know, parents said, bear in mind that technology is very new. So they didn't really think of it in those kind of terms necessarily. As is the way, it's like with the internet. These days you go, why don't you put parental controls on your child's computer? Many parents don't know about those kind of things, or don't know how to do those kind of things. They may just not think to do that. Because when they go searching on the internet, they just don't look for that kind of stuff. But kids are curious and they start poking around. Yeah. Interestingly, this guy, Nigel Andrews, a couple of articles here which are from the Financial Times, actually, which are some of the very few voices that are kind of against the censorship. They're cautious about that and advise against, you know, overstepping the mark. It's actually quite an interesting read. When I was at school, I saw 2 Million Maniacs and Die Screaming with Sharp Things in Your Head, Volume 2. It's true. Can't go through details. Too gruesome. Oh, dear. I mean, eventually I did see some horror films, but, you know, it took a little while. But, you know, so we're kind of like still in 1983. So 1983 was an incredibly packed year for the kind of actions that were going on. Obviously, the Video Nasties, the Video Recordings Act was being discussed and eventually passes in its second form, which, like I say, it basically channeled everything through the BBFC. If you're going to release a cassette with material on it, it had to go through the BBFC, with only a few exceptions. And the exceptions are kind of like a little bit marginal, though you'd have to kind of go some. There were some prosecutions on exempt things because they weren't as exempt as the people who released it thought it was. 4 to 10 children. 6-year-old addicts of the Video Nasties. Yeah, another one actually kind of interesting. So this article actually is where people started realising that the parliamentary video... where is it? Parliamentary Group Video Inquiry was actually bullshit. And this goes into some details. And of course it's fairly early details. But the people who are involved with it... But basically, Clifford Hill was accused of breaking into the facility to take all the records and stuff in the middle of the night. He just went in and raided the place and took all the records away. Then he just made up his own conclusions. Very dishonest guy, in my opinion. But, kids in video, shock. almost half the children in England and Wales have watched a video nasty. It's gone up to 50%, despite the fact that they already know there's problems with the parliamentary video group. This is another survey, which is... No, it is the Parliamentary Video Inquiry. So whichever version of that they were reading, I've got no idea. It should be fairly clear by now that most of the tabloids and stuff, the coverage was not particularly honest. And it wasn't much better on the TV either. But the tabloids in particular were very, very well known for being incredibly hyperbolic. They were very, very kind of upfront with pushing out the lurid headlines and attention-grabbing stuff and being over the top with their language. Guy Cumberbatch, that was the fellow I was talking about who kind of looked at the survey and debunked it, basically. Interesting guy. But we'll zip for a few more of these. How they tried to make me a star. Is it more about the whole kind of the police? This article is basically how the police were kind of going very aggressively at video distributors and renters, right? So they would just go in and they would just haul a load of stuff, and that is section 3. But like I say, we'll have a quick look at those. I say quick look; it might take a few minutes. We'll have a look at those 2 bits of legislation when we get to the end. 1 in 2 kids watch the video nasties. It's gone up 10%. You know, it's like, what the hell is going on with these people? Video filth that warps the minds of our young. Daily Express. Daily Express was feeling a little bit left out by this point, I think, because they just lost a lot of momentum to the Daily Mail. On a slightly related note, the vast majority of newspapers are right-leaning, so does anybody know what a paper like The Guardian reported on the subject of the nasties? Well, The Guardian basically took a... They weren't particularly protective of film censorship in general. They weren't as hyperbolic necessarily, but they often had often enough had articles on this stuff. They didn't report on it nearly as much. So you got like the Independent, the Times, and the likes. And the thing is, it's like the Financial Times is the first one that I found that really had kind of a defence of, you know, not so much a defence of the video nasties, but certainly a warning about descending into censorship kind of stuff. Guardian is a shockingly poor newspaper. Depends. The thing is, there's a lot more editorialising these days. There's a lot more personal opinion in most of the newspapers. Back in the day, they were actually pretty good, but not many people would have read them, is the thing, comparatively. Bear in mind that the tabloids were really aimed at kind of, you know, the unwashed masses. Used language and techniques that spoke to regular people. Whereas something like The Guardian or The Times or The Independent, the broadsheets basically, were read by, you know, well-to-do city folk, generally. This is the thing. There's a class thing when it comes to censorship. Always has been. Battleship Potemkin, when it was screened originally, when it was when it came out, was screened in some film clubs. And if you were kind of well-to-do, sort of white, middle, upper-class film club, then you could watch it. But if you're a working men's club that wanted to screen it, you couldn't. Because they were worried about, you know, it riling up the masses. This literally happened. Savage terror. See, this is a funny thing. In video filth that warps the mind of our young. Savage terror is it's a bizarre film. Disturbing is not what I would call it. Not in the slightest. Dear, oh dear. Scandal of banned video nasties. Children will still be able to hire banned video nasties for the next 3 years. So we're in October 1985 at this point. So we're only a few pages of of newspapers left, and then we'll have a quick talk about the various acts. So once the Video Recordings Act actually passed, there was a time period of 3 years where if you owned some video cassettes, you could send them to the BBFC, and the BBFC would watch them and make sure they were certifiable. Basically, make sure that they actually met their guidelines. Obviously, it's a huge task. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of cassettes. And they'd have to watch them all, pretty much. So, yes, there was a grace period. Otherwise, millions upon millions of pounds worth of stock would have had to have gone, and from people who could ill afford to replace them. But they're complaining about the fact that they were still going to be available. But that's the reason why, essentially. So you can actually get cassettes that have like a stuck-on BBFC certificate, from the old rental days. That's why. That's why it's not got the original printed kind of label with the certificate on. They've got a stuck an 18 certificate on it. If it passed, if it didn't, it would just get destroyed. But yeah, but they still had this concerns about these films being available, even in 1985. Yeah, so September 1985 is when the 1984 Video Recordings Act was actually passed, and we're in November, and they're still going at it. So we'll call it a evening on that bit. I hope that wasn't too boring. But it gives you a good idea of quite what's going on with the main kind of chunk of the media, print media. It was pretty vicious, to say the least. So the Video Recording Act, like I say, was passed in about September 1985, or at least enacted in September 1985, with a grace period for video rental guys to kind of either get the stuff kind of checked or get rid of, destroy it. So what was passed? Well, originally we are, and the videos were originally kind of prosecuted underneath the Obscene Publications Act, right? So if we can find the one, right? Not that one. Is it that one? Let's see if I can find the right tab for that. Oh, that's the one. Okay. So this is the Obscene Publications Act 1959. I've read this thing more times than I really should have done. This along with the Video Recordings Act. And the two kind of work in concert. Brilliant images, really enjoyed it. Thank you, John. That's very sweet of you. So this is the Obscene Publications Act 1959. It is the progenitor of the Video Nasties, or the Video Recordings Act, or at least the Video Recordings Act is basically works in concert to some degree with this. The Obscene Publications Act is specifically, originally, aimed at pornography and not violence, right? So that's kind of, obscenity in general was kind of regarded more as a sex work kind of, in terms of art, legislation. Now, I have all too often, including today, seen in articles. I should probably mention, you've got the main video nasties list, and you've got the section 3 list. There is no Section 1. Right, this is what the articles kind of keep getting wrong, including Wikipedia, which I corrected and then it was changed back. So the Wikipedia article on the video Nasties is actually is wrong in a significant way. The person that edited it decided that the prosecuted stuff was Section 1, the or the failed prosecutions was Section 2, and Section 3 was, well, what is Section 3? So Section 1 is actually the test for obscenity. It is not the thing that is actually prosecuted on. This basically sets out what it is that the Act covers. For the purposes of this Act, an article should be deemed obscene if its effect, where the article comprises of 2 or more distinct items, the effect of any one of these items, if taken as a whole, such as to tend to deprave and corrupt persons who are likely, having all regard to all relevant circumstances, to read, see, or hear the matter contained or embodied in it. Which basically means, you can have obscene material, or at least stuff that could be deemed obscene, but if it's in context, it's not deemed to be obscene in the eyes of the law. So a sex act in one film could be deemed to be depraved and corrupt, or at least have a risk of depraving and corrupting a significant proportion of the audience who are likely to see it. It can have that act in there if it's in context, if it's justified by the context of the whole thing. So you can't just look at that one section and go, that's obscene, that bit. You have to go, the whole film is obscene because it does this, that, and the other, or it doesn't justify that. Thank you, Henry. 2. In this Act, article means any description of an article containing or embodying matter to be read or looked at, or both, any sound record and any film or other record of a picture or pictures. So just describing what it is that an article is. So it could be a video cassette, it could be a book, it could be a reel of film, so on and so forth. And it then goes on to describe what a publisher is. A person, for the purposes of this Act, a person publishes an article who distributes, circulates, sells, etc., etc. In the case of an article containing or embodying matter to be looked at, or a record, shows, plays, or projects, that they transmit it electronically or otherwise. So that is essentially kind of the sort of thing that Section 1 is. So it's not something that you actually get prosecuted on. All Part 1, Section 1 is kind of setting out the scope of what we're talking about. What does that include? What does that not include? Kind of setting out the terms. What is publication? So it kind of describes those various terms before you move on. So if you see an article that says this was prosecuted under Section 1, when it's talking about this particular Act, you know that that person hasn't actually done their research, hasn't read the Act. And it's not hard to read. It really isn't. You just got to look at it. They look at it and go, there's Section 2 and Section 3, that's all they know about. And I have had this question asked, and I actually applaud people who ask the question, what is Section 1? Was there anything prosecuted under Section 1? Because you can then tell them. It's the ones that sort of assume that, because there must be 3 sections that everything's prosecuted under. That's the thing, Section 3, you don't get prosecuted under Section 3. And we will talk about that in a second. Section 2, prohibition of publication of obscene matter. So this is where you get taken to court and you get prosecuted under Section 2 of the Obscene Publications Act. And this section describes the things that they will prosecute you under penalties on summary conviction to a fine not exceeding £100 or to imprisonment of a term not exceeding 6 months. This is for subjects as hereinafter provided any person, whether for gain or not, publishes an obscene article, or who has an obscene article for publication or gain. Now, Section 1, it's told you what is obscene, or at least what the test for obscenity is. So Section 2 is about prosecution, what you can be prosecuted for, what are the penalties for. And that's why Section 2 is the prosecuted and the unsuccessfully prosecuted. It all went to court. Everything got kind of tested against Section 2. And Section 3 is the powers of search and seizure. Right? So Section 3 is kind of like the with customs and excise. When you get something kind of sent to you into this country, sometimes they can send you a letter and say we've withheld this particular item because it could violate certain laws, etc. It's not permitted in this country, or we suspect it's not permitted in this country. Sometimes you can argue it with them and actually get the thing. Other times they can just take it. Now, they don't have to go to court to actually do that, right? Because that would be just impossible to do. They have the right, if they have reasonable suspicion, just keep that item, and then you have to nip down to there and argue it with them. Section 3 of the Obscene Publication Act is exactly the same, really, in practice. The police can take stuff that they reasonably suspect is contraband, if you like, and you have to go to a magistrate and argue why it's not. So essentially it gives the police the right to just walk in and steal your shit. It's essentially what it is. It doesn't necessarily just relate to video. There's various aspects and applications for this kind of thing. So I've always felt that Section 3 is the most unjust version of it. And that's why stuff like the Best Little Whorehouse in Texas was taken from somebody's shelf. It's the reason why a Serbian film was taken off the shelves of a Blockbuster or something like that. Despite it having a BBFC certificate, the police walked in and just took it because they had the right to do that. So that's Section 1, 2 and 3. Notice, Section 1, there won't be any titles on it because it's the definitional part of the legislation. So the actual test for obscenity is the most, that's the interesting part, because that's the bit that sort of relies on human interpretation and a court's jury interpreting whether or not they think it's obscene. Although I'm not sure if it was more of a... I think they did have juries for that. I'm not 100% sure, but when it goes to the court, whoever decides whether or not it is obscene. And this caused problems, because one jury in one place would decide Evil Dead was obscene. In another place, they'd decide that Evil Dead was clearly not obscene. So this was the battle why the OPA was not a very effective thing to really kind of battle the video nasties with, because it depended where you were from. You could go further up north and it's working class people and they might be a bit more willing to let it go than perhaps people down in London. So for instance, so you could have it literally in one county, it would be illegal, and in another county, neighbouring one, it's the opposite. So if the OPA was used, basically, a cassette could be available in Leicestershire and illegal in Nottinghamshire. And if you're in Nottinghamshire, you could just travel like a few minutes down the road, go to a video store in Leicestershire, get it out, take it back, watch it, and kick it back. So not very effective. Not very effective. It was not really kind of built to deal with the kind of thing that a video cassette is. But yeah, so looking at the Video Recordings Act, which you should be fairly familiar with considering how much I've talked about it. Section 1 just tells you the term, explains the terms. Section 2, basically the Video Recordings Act is essentially a way of kind of funneling everything through the designated authority, i.e. the BBFC. So it can still, works can still be kind of prosecuted under the Obscene Publications Act, but hopefully if you've gone through the BBFC, then you shouldn't have that risk, because that is one of the things that the BBFC will kind of take into consideration, along with excuse me, along with the Cinematographic Act for animals and things like that. They take those into consideration when they actually kind of do the licensing for it, the certification for it. So what the video recording did was just basically sort of run it through there, and the BBFC would basically vet it for lawfulness, apart from anything else. Of course, they do more. They do have opinion. They take into mind public sentiment, and they especially these days, they do a lot of surveys, and they talk to various kind of aspects of the communities, and try to take that into and make it into policy. Basically, is the idea. Someone like James Furman really kind of did put his own stamp on it, though. And they all will, to be fair, to some extent, whoever is the president. It's Natasha Kalinske or something like that now. The newsreader, I think she was at one point, if I remember right. So, yeah, and it talks about kind of exempted works, exempted supplies. So it tells you, what is kind of applicable, what is not applicable, what are the exemptions. Supply of video recorded for the purpose of the exhibition of any video work contained in the recording in premises other than a dwelling house. So are you going to be showing it in a pub? That kind of thing. And it's this sort of section, authority to determine the suitability of video works for classification. That's basically saying Home Secretary gets, or Secretary for State points at some people, say you can do that job. In which case it was the BBFC, which it was always likely to be. There was some argument about whether the BBFC took it or not. There was quite a bit of discussion about that at one point, but it was like, well, they know how to do that kind of stuff. And, the BBFC did really well out of it because their business went through the bloody roof. Like somebody on one of the interviews kind of said they moved from a dingy little office with a couple of floors to a big ass building in Soho Square, I think it is, or something like that. Or Russell Square, I think it was somewhere around there. But, yeah. Tells you about parliamentary procedure for designation. So there's not an awful lot of kind of details on what should be legal and what shouldn't be legal. It's kind of very, but I mean, it's very difficult to legislate in that, because how the fuck do you legislate for a whole bunch of stuff that you haven't even had the chance to experience at this point? So, like I say, it's more a kind of like regulating the product than it is about the content. The content BBFC will worry about. The government doesn't have to worry about it, and it means that they keep their hands clear of the censorship thing. However, because the Secretary of State controls who is the designated agent to do that, there's always this risk that, the BBFC could have that yanked away from them. So if these laws exist, how come we now have Island of Death SS Experiment Camp in Shops Uncut? Because they're no longer deemed to be obscene. for a number of reasons. Not least that the impact of that film has kind of changed. Viewing sensibilities have changed, all that kind of stuff. The law doesn't need to change to allow for that. It's more the definition of what is obscene and that kind of stuff shifts and changes. And the BBFC have to sort of interpret that through interviewing people and talking to politicians and stuff like that, but talking to regular folks. But yeah, it even tells you about kind of like certain video recordings only to be supplied in licensed sex shops. So they have their own rating called the R18, which is not one that many people know about. So you've got like kind of UUC, PG, was it 12, 12A, 15, 18, and R18. R18 is restricted 18, and that means you have to be a licensed sex shop to actually stock it. So if I want a copy of Deep Throat, as for instance, there's two versions. There's an 18 certificate version, and there's an R18 version. I don't recommend the 18 version. It's horribly reframed, for obvious reasons. Maggie Simpson watched a video, Nasties. Oh dear. Finally we know the culprit along the say. Yes. But yeah. So basically, what was the aftermath of this? That's something you already know. Well, I suppose we can have a quick look at the talk about briefly what was the resurgence. And we've had a couple of resurgences of the Video Nasties scare. First one being really kind of, there was a little thing in the 80s when it came to, let me just double check something. I need to check a date. So, 87, yeah, so just checking on that. So the Hungerford Massacre in 87. This does actually go right into the 90s as well. So this is kind of 87, but... So we had Michael Ryan, Hungerford Massacre. That prompted some video censorship, at least, and attempted it. I do remember the shots of the video of Rambo, First Blood Part 2, on the front covers of like The Sun. I think we'll probably get to see that at some point. So that prompted a little bit of a thing. So mid-90s, there was also another sort of scare. So obviously you've got stuff like that going on. There was another scare, and kind of like Natural Born Killers, and because there'd been, so Dunblane, I think it was, that happened, and then Natural Born Killers and a couple of other films got sort of delayed, and then there was yet again, another kind of revival of, in the newspapers at least, of these horrible films, we can't have them. Natural Born Killers was kind of an interesting one because the BBFC sort of just withheld a certificate. It was due a release. And then it basically kind of got held back when Dunblane happened. And it got held back for about a year or two, I think it was. It took forever for it to finally get sort of released. And the thing is, it's easy to blame the BBFC for that, but they sort of had to do it. It was kind of an existential moment. Because if if they'd gone and released it, then there would have been basically a lot of backlash on them. And the Home Secretary, bear in mind, there was always a fractious relationship between Downing Street and the BBFC. The Home Secretary could have just basically gone, no, fuck it, you guys are out, we'll do it ourselves, or we'll get somebody else to do it. The government wouldn't have been able to cope with it. It's a lot of work. Oh dear. Cops swooped to seize 3,000 sick killer videos. I'm not sure which ones they're actually talking about there. Oh, hang on. Human experiments, bloodbath, carnage, blood-sucking freaks, weasels ripped by flesh, and the lizard. There's a woman, lizard in a woman's skin. None of them are particularly obscene. They're not going to deprave and corrupt you. But, yeah. Now IRA self-snuff videos. Okay. My God. See, you almost forget about that. So here you go. And this is like 93. So they went in hard on these. On this thing. It's, of course, they started blaming child's play and all that kind of stuff. So we had, a few scares like this which came along. It just kind of revived that sort of feeling. And because, it's naturally quite an upsetting and difficult to understand thing when something like this happens. And the tabloids are so ill-equipped to deal with any of this kind of stuff that they come out with this crap that they sell to the audience to give them a target for their hate and anger. And it's not that, those two young lads that the public shouldn't hate and all that kind of stuff, because it's not what I'm saying. It's more when you misdirect the blame from these kids, kind of, which in my opinion is a lot it's to do with their environment they're bringing up, that kind of stuff. And there's some argument that they were impaired to some degree. And it's not to forgive them for that kind of stuff, but to point in the wrong direction, to point at something so frivolous as Child's Play 3, and to blame that, is not only wrong, it's careless. In fact, I think it's almost, asking for the real solutions to be kind of looked at. This is the problem with this kind of misdirection. It's very unfortunate because it's dangerous. Yeah, I believe so, Minty. It's hard to sort of tell where most of them are gone, because one of them did get outed, didn't he, when he was out? Was it Venables? Somebody sort of got a current photo of him and spread it out, and I don't feel terribly sympathetic towards him, because he clearly still got problems. But yeah, half-time newspapers, MPs, etc. simply want simple solutions to involved real problems. Yes. Yeah, it's an easy thing to point at and go, it's over there. And that's part of the reason why Maggie Thatcher got involved in the first place. I don't think ideologically it was something she was particularly for, but it was convenient. It's easy to point over there and go, well, what's the cost? We lose a few nasty, horrible films. Cheap, isn't it? At half the price. So, there were many, many prosecutions along the way, though. Particularly in the prior to the video nasties being banned by the VRA. A lot of prosecutions, a lot of money, some jail time, for distributors and stuff like that. I think Nightmare on the Damaged Brain, the distributor for that, got a couple of years. As it turned out, so like, I think it was about 2009. It's either 2007 or 2009. Somebody realised that the Video Recordings Act of 1984 was null and void. It was unlawfully enforced, which is probably one of the funniest and most tragic pieces of legislation that I've heard. It was a real... it must have been such a weird experience for the people who kind of suffered under it. The people that had their livelihoods taken away, sometimes their liberty taken away, on the strength of a bit of legislation that hadn't even been enforced lawfully or enacted lawfully. The problem was they did the legislation and somebody forgot to sign off on some bit, which basically they had to, because we're a part of the EU or EEC. They were supposed to go to the EEC, European Economic Community, and go, this is a law that we're putting into place. The reason being, it effectively affects commerce between the continent and the UK. Because any films coming into the country have to be BBFC compliant, right? There's a restriction on trade, so they had to sign off in Brussels. Somebody forgot to do that, so it was unlawful, essentially. So in 2010, I would say, the Video Recordings Act was basically re-ratified with very, very minor... I don't think there's much changes in it whatsoever. And why would they? Because, I mean, effectively, it was a workable piece of legislation. They just needed to re-sign it off. So there was a little bit of injustice kind of happened on that. A little bit of carelessness, and it was partly because they rushed it through. They really did. Margaret Thatcher cited cannibal holocaust as the cause of Falklands War. Easier to scapegoat. This is sounded a bit Canadian, didn't it? Scapegoat. Nonsense like horror films and video games where I'm actually bothered to look at the real issues. Yeah. VPRC was invented to tone down the artwork, make them boring. It was more... Less that it was about making it boring, but it was more about avoiding allowing covers like Driller Killer and SS Experiment Camp, to be fair. But it's actually part of the licensing process. They're supposed to go through that. And that's what got, their involvement is what got Mikey to lose its license. Or their lack of involvement, shall I say. Because I think it was over Christmas or something like that. But, yeah. That was kind of involved. And bear in mind, if you're ever kind of researching into this stuff, that's a whistle-stop tour. The Video Nasties. And that's nearly 3 hours. That's 2 3/4 hours that's just taken me to run through. My voice is a little raw. It's so easy to go a lot further into this kind of stuff. And actually looking at some of the articles and some of the articles that aren't in this thing. So the place that this is at is basically Book of the Dead, Video Nasties, and there's a download, although it does appear to be a little bit... It goes through Angel Fire or something like that. It does flag my computer up with my VPN up with like potentially malicious stuff, and that could be some sort of pop-up link that my VPN blocks. Anyway, so I've downloaded it. Okay, but if you go get it, just be a little careful. Make sure you've got the proper protection in place. Put on your computer condom before you go grabbing it. But other resources, obviously there's BBF. You can actually investigate the BBFC archives to some extent. It takes a bit of kind of work to do. But good books. The Video Nasties, Freedom and Censorship in the Media. Martin Barker. Very, very good book. Seminal book. It's a little pricey and difficult to get hold of, but you can occasionally pick it up. I wouldn't pay much more than about 90 to 100 quid for it if you're feeling flush. Sometimes it comes out for about 30 or 40. But if you can get hold of a copy, get hold of it. It's an incredible book. It only ever had one release, so there's no... because it was a product of the time, and it was released at the height of the Video Nasty scare prior to the Video Recordings Act. But it has, of the time, contemporary reporting or criticism of what was going on. So it's fascinating articles in there. Censored by Tom Dewey Matthews is incredible. It's such a good book, and it's really cheap. So check out, you can find it on Amazon and various other bookshops. So definitely, that's a really, really good one to go for. The BBFC have a book which is done by the BFI, the British Film Institute. That is a really interesting read, and that does have some information, although it's only part of the book, but it is definitely worth reading. If you can get access to a local university's library, you can sometimes arrange that kind of stuff. You can find articles and stuff like old copies of Sight and Sound from the time, which have some really interesting articles in it, which are not in this. But there's many, many places that you can go. One thing I would advise is you're just very careful about checking out articles. A lot of articles are wrong, which is why I did that last coverage of the OPA and the VRA, because people get that wrong all the time, and it seems to be coming fucking canon, and it does my head in. There is no Section 1 prosecutions. That's not how that act works. You don't have to be a lawyer to figure that out. I mean, over and above that, there's many, many resources. And really, really good books. And maybe I should do a video at some point, kind of like talking about various sources that I've used, that kind of thing. Obviously, Video Nasty's definitive documentary is incredible. Both of them really interesting. Which is funny, actually, because Mark Morris, when I talked to him, because I sort of messaged him and I said, look, can you just clarify what Section 3 is for me? Because I don't really understand it. And he says, yeah, call me on this number. I was like, oh, fucking hell, okay, right. So I called him and I told him about it. I did sort of say to him at the time, I'm going to be doing a series on the Section 3 films. And he took an exception to it for some reason. Then he sort of apologised and said, look, I've just had a bad day, I'm sorry. So I don't know how he feels about me. He felt I was stepping on his toes, I think. But as I pointed out to him, I says I'd been into doing the Video Nasties, the Nasties review for about 2 years before he started doing his documentary. I says, you kind of stole my thunder on that one a bit, because he completed his documentary before I finished mine. I'm one man doing 79 odd films. I didn't have a load of mates to kind of shop that out to. But I've got the utmost respect for his stuff. His research is amazing on that. And Jake West, it's fantastic work. So even if he doesn't like me, I love his stuff. There you go. Censored is good, but a lot of cut details are yeah. There's always a few things that might be a little bit kind of waffy on that. But it is a damn good book. Website used to be good, but now it's pretty useless. try and think if there's any other sources which are particularly useful. Obviously, I mean, one of the things which I have been thinking about doing, which I've been sort of toying with, in fact, I've written quite a bit on it, but I keep putting the damn thing down, is more of a politically skewed look at the video nasties. So looking much more closely at the Hansard notes and stuff like that, and the political kind of toing and froing, and their reaction to the media and the kind of stuff which was going on. They're sort of putting that together is actually a fascinating part of it, is why the government chose to do this. The first part of the video Nasties finale, or the Nasties review finale, is kind of that, but I would like to expand that. That took a lot of research. What would actually fall under Section 1? There is nothing falls under Section 1. Section 1 is not a prosecution section. That's the thing. So Section 1 is about definitions. It's the scope of what can be prosecuted under Section 2, right? It doesn't prescribe any prosecution in and of itself. It just says what can be prosecuted under Section 2. So it doesn't get prosecuted under Section 1. Yes, Section 3 basically is search and seizure. So yes, the police can go in, they can take it, and you'd have to go to the magistrate to actually get it back. You'd have to argue in court. But it's a non-prosecution path. It just made it easier for the police, basically. It's a lazy thing for the police. Saves them time and money and effort. But yeah. So I hope you I hope you enjoyed that. It's been an interesting one to do. It's been a while since I've really sort of gone into any kind of detail on that kind of stuff. So that was quite a fascinating little thing for me, and actually kind of it was very ramble. It was a very rambly one. I did warn it was a Ramblaholic. It is very difficult to streamline this stuff because there's so much which happened, especially in about late 1982 to 1984 particularly. That was full on. There was just so much going on one way or another. But to cover the whole kind of who the players are, for one thing, the climate of the time when videos came around, and how people sort of reacted to that, plus the how the media handled it. One of the things it's harder to actually find the information for is the TV end of things, because a lot of those recordings don't exist anymore, unfortunately. Fortunately, the British Library, for instance, is a really good resource for the kind of research on like the papers and stuff like that. I would love to go down there and find all the articles that are kind of missing from this, because there's a few. And the person who kind of made this actually does list a bunch of the stuff which is kind of missing that they know of. Of course there's more, but I'm sure the British Library probably has copies of those things, plus they will have copies of Sight and Sound and the various different magazines that were around, plus probably kind of other types of articles and that kind of stuff. They'll have a load of information there, and you can go down, you have to book in and tell them what it is you're after and all that kind of stuff, so it'll all be in the archives and stuff like that. So it's not terribly convenient, but you can do it. And this person that did this did such an amazing job. And they were generous enough just to make it a resource. Like it says, it took about 40 hours and cost 130 in printing and travel costs, which is actually, they were very, very efficient. They were very, very efficient. So an incredible job, though. And they made it available to everyone for free. So good on them. I'll get it section 1, 2, etc. Just makes it sound like it's some kind of tier list. No. So when you say section 1, 2, and 3, it's literally sections of the Obscene Publications Act. And that's the way you've got to think about it. And the sections do different things. So section 3 is not a prosecution list. It's not. It's just a search and seizure. So that's the mechanisms that the police have to be able to go into a place to search and what they can take away. Which is why section 3 is, as you say, it meant that the police could take stuff without having a prosecution of the owner, because it's search and seizure specifically. But if they found something and they went in and they found something legitimately obscene, say they went in there after the Video Recordings Act, or after I Spit on Your Grave got prosecuted or whatever, and they found a copy of that film in there, they would be able to prosecute the owner for that under section 2. Yeah. But it's been a bugbear of mine, because every time I see that, especially on Wikipedia, it just breaks my fucking heart that this, when you change it, then somebody just goes, "Oh, well, you changed my writing," kind of thing. It's like, no, I corrected it. It's if you can't be asked to read the Obscene Publications Act and understand what that is, then you've got no place writing that on something like Wikipedia. Personally, won't read in my mail to this day because of their articles on this kind of thing. Oh God, what was it? I think it was the Sun in Liverpool. I think they can't still to this day can't sell the Sun, the newspaper, the Sun, in Liverpool because of their coverage of the fire at the football stadium, Hillsborough. Because it's absolute bullshit. It was pretty terrible. Fight for Your Life is one that was banned and still is. Yes, it is, and it's partly because of the language. I don't think it should be banned, but the BBFC feel it's so. The characters are so vilely racist that they can't justify the release. I don't know if they've ever tried to get it re-released lately. I do wonder if it would get through these days. Yes. Yeah, the coverage of Hillsborough was astonishingly bad. They basically blamed the fans who died for the fire. And it was pretty rank. It was pretty goddamn rank. But there you go. Okay, folks, I'm going to call it an evening there because my voice will give out if I keep yapping on for much longer. Have a lovely day tomorrow. Try not to get too drunk. Or try to get very drunk. Try not to argue with the family when you play Monopoly, etc., etc. Try not to get depraved and corrupt when you watch the Bond movie. And don't forget that it's the King's speech, not the Queen's speech. There you go. Hopefully, I'll do a New Year's Eve stream. Not quite sure what I'm going to do. It might be a movie. I think it might be quite nice for a movie or two. And we'll see in the new year together. And I look forward to that. And hopefully it won't be 3 hours solid of me absolutely trying to trounce my way through this goddamn amount of material. There's so much I've missed out on this evening. Believe me, it's just the detail you have to go into if you're writing on it is just fucking intense. But I shall say good night to you folks. Have a lovely time. And thank you so much for joining. Until next time, take care, folks.